If a book can change the way you see the world, this is where you'll find it. I'm Karo-chan. Let's explore together the books that truly shape our destinies. Today, the book we're diving into is Work, Consumerism, and the New Poor by Zygmunt Bauman. It helps us rediscover why we keep working nonstop and how we've been swept up by consumerism, turning into the so-called new poor, defined not by ourselves but by others. Let's start with two things we all run into in daily life. And I bet you felt the same way. First, have you ever heard your elders say over and over again, work hard, stay diligent, and you'll live a good life? But look around now. The delivery guy at your apartment gate runs from morning till night, rain or shine. The young people working basic office jobs are staying up late, rushing to finish projects, and when payday comes, after rent and commuting costs, there's barely anything left. They're not lazy. They're working even harder than the older generations. So why is it that the harder they work, the less secure they feel, and the harder it gets to save money? Second, when you're out shopping or scrolling through your friends' posts, have you ever felt this way? Some people buy luxury goods without blinking, or fly to another city on the weekend just to check in at some trendy hotel. But you? You hesitate half a day before buying a 5-milk tea, and think twice before paying for an online course to improve your skills. Nowadays, being poor isn't just about not having food to eat. It's more like not being able to consume like others do. You can't afford what's trending, can't keep up with popular lifestyles, and it feels like you're being quietly excluded from normal life. There's always this small panic sitting in your chest. These two struggles are exactly what Zygmunt Bauman tries to uncover in his book, Work, Consumerism, and the New Poor. The meaning of poverty has never stayed the same. Back in the industrial era, the definition was simple. If you didn't work, you were poor. As long as you worked hard, you could eat, have a place to live, and be considered a normal person. But in today's consumer age, that definition has quietly shifted. Even if you have a job, if you can't consume like others do, if you don't know how to buy the right things, you'll be seen as an outsider, labeled as one of the poor. Bauman didn't write this book to talk about complicated theories. He wanted to help us see clearly that phrases like work hard and spend wisely are not eternal truths, but rules invented by their times. The industrial era needed a massive workforce, so it created a work ethic, making people believe that working hard was a duty, even a source of pride. Then the consumer era needed people to spend more, so it created a consumer aesthetic, making people believe that being able to choose and buy the right things is what shows ability and taste. And it's exactly these rules that have shaped what being poor looks like in different eras. Next, we'll follow this logic step by step. First, to understand where the industrial work ethic came from and how it tied working to being a good person. Then, we'll see how society shifted toward consumerism and how those who can't consume properly ended up becoming the new poor. Once we understand all this, we'll realize today's poverty isn't a personal failure. It's that the rules have changed. And only by seeing those rules clearly can we figure out how to respond. Let's start by breaking a deep-rooted misconception. People must work, and work is noble. This idea isn't something we were born with, nor is it an ancient moral code passed down from our ancestors. It was actually invented after the Industrial Revolution, designed specifically to lure farmers into factories. Sociologist Zygmunt Bauman called this rule the work ethic in his book Work, Consumerism, and the New Poor. Today, let's really break it down. What exactly is it, and how did it make people obedient little cogs in the industrial machine? First, we need to be clear. The work ethic is basically a kind of commandment. Just like religious commandments in the past, it has visible rules that must be followed and hidden assumptions people are expected to accept. Let's look at the two main ideas on the surface. The first one says, to survive and be happy, you need to do something that society approves of and get paid for it. Back then, the only approved work was factory work. If you stayed home farming your own land or living off your craft, that didn't count as a real job. No pay, no survival. The second rule is even harsher. Being content or not wanting to work more is shameful. Even if you've already earned enough in a month to eat and pay rent, taking a few days off to rest is seen as immoral. The only acceptable reason to rest is to recover so you can work harder later, like if you're sick. Otherwise, resting means you're lazy, and people will look down on you for it. These two principles seem reasonable at first glance, but if you think deeper, they actually rest on two hidden assumptions. The first assumption is that most people are able to work, and as long as they work, they can earn enough to live. But if there aren't enough factory jobs, or the pay is too low to survive, then the whole work-to-live logic collapses. The second assumption is even more important. Only work that earns money counts as real work. Taking care of your kids or elderly parents all day doesn't count because it's unpaid. Helping your neighbor fix furniture or writing Spring Festival couplets for friends, not work either, unless you charge them. These assumptions draw a boundary around what counts as work. Only labor inside factories, the kind that makes profit for capitalists, is considered useful and dignified. So why did they create such a system? Because after the Industrial Revolution, factory owners faced a huge problem. Farmers didn't want to work in factories. Think about it. Before, farming was hard, but at least you were your own boss. You decided when to plant, what to grow, when to rest. Craftsmen and peddlers had freedom too. But in a factory? You had to obey the clock, punch in on time, and even being 1 second late could get you yelled at. You had to obey the foreman. If your job was to tighten screws, you couldn't weld parts. Make a mistake, and you'd be punished. Work days lasted 10, 12, even 14 hours, with barely time for a sip of water. Farmers couldn't stand that kind of loss of freedom, so a lot of factories couldn't find workers. The owners were furious, complaining every day that people were too lazy, that even good pay couldn't make them work more. Complaining didn't help, though. They needed something stronger to force people's compliance. So the government stepped in and introduced the Poor Law. Its main rule was simple. Relief money would only be given to those who agreed to enter the workhouses. And what were those workhouses like? The conditions were worse than you can imagine. Dozens of people crammed into tiny, filthy rooms, sleeping on piles of straw, eating thin porridge sometimes mixed with sand. They were forced to work every day, doing the dirtiest, hardest labor, like breaking stones or spinning rough cloth. If they didn't finish their quota, they didn't eat. The government designed it that way so the poor would think, better to work in a factory than suffer here. No matter how bad factory life was, it was still better than the workhouse. Bauman called this system work or die. Back then, society gave the poor only two choices. There was no middle ground. If you didn't go to the factory, your only options were the workhouse or starving to death. To stay alive, you had to obey the factory and follow the so-called work ethic. But it wasn't just about force. There was also soft persuasion, brainwashing people into believing that working in a factory was the right thing to do, even something honorable. At the time, preachers, economists, and politicians all joined forces, preaching the same message day after day. Work makes you a better person, and people who don't work are lazy and will fall into sin. One economist even claimed that the poor were poor because they were too lazy. If only they worked harder, they'd live a good life. Priests added their part, saying, "Work is God's will. Through hard work, you redeem your sins and earn your place in heaven." And after hearing this enough times, people started to believe it. I'm poor not because the factory pays me too little, but because I don't work hard enough. I'm not just working to eat, I'm doing something noble. Even more importantly, the industrial age turned work into everyone's identity card. In the past, who you were depended on who your father was. If your father was a landlord, you were the young master. If he was a farmer, you were a farmer too. Your birth determined everything. But in the industrial age, that no longer worked. Now, who you were depended on what you did for a living. If you were a textile worker, you were part of the working class. If you were an engineer, you were middle class. But if you didn't have a job, well, you weren't even seen as a normal person. Work didn't just give you money. It defined your place in society. Engineers stood higher than factory workers, and workers stood higher than drifters or beggars. Even your lifestyle and your social circle were shaped by your job. Engineers drank tea together and talked about technology. Workers drank together and talked about factory life. Bauman called this process the making of producers. The whole society was training you, first and foremost, to be a worker. Only then could you be considered a normal person. If you couldn't work, you had no identity, no dignity, and no one respected you. By this point, the survival rules of the industrial age were crystal clear. The work ethic was the core. On one side, hard measures like the Poor Law forced people into factories. On the other, soft propaganda about the nobility of work trained their minds. And finally, identity itself was defined by work, binding people tightly to the production line. Under this rule, poverty was simple. If you didn't work, you were poor. If you didn't work, you were abnormal. As long as you worked hard, you could have food, a place in society, and a sense of dignity. That was the survival logic everyone lived by back then. But here's the question. Could that system last forever? As machines got better and better, one factory could produce what used to take hundreds of workers. There simply weren't that many producers needed anymore. So what then? Society couldn't just feed all the extra people doing nothing. And so, a new rule slowly emerged. Instead of needing you to be a producer, society started needing you to be a consumer. And with that shift, the meaning of poverty changed too. That's what we'll talk about next, the age of consumption. Why in the modern world, not knowing how to consume makes you the new kind of poor. In the last part, we talked about how, in the industrial era, the work ethic tied people to the production line. As long as you worked hard, you had food, dignity, and a place in society. If you didn't work, you were considered poor. But as machines became more powerful, say one automated assembly line could replace 100 workers, a big problem appeared. Factories no longer needed so many producers. So what should happen to all those extra people? Society couldn't just keep feeding them forever, right? The answer was simple. Shift the core rule of society from be a producer to be a consumer. In the past, production came first. You made as much as you could, then sold it. Now it's the opposite. You only produce what you can sell. So people have to consume more, dare to spend. Even not consuming becomes a problem. This shift might look like a small change, from working to spending. But it completely rewrote the definition of poverty and reshaped how people survive. Let's break this down step by step. First, the core standard of judgment in the consumer era changed. It's no longer how well you work, but how well you choose. In the industrial era, people were judged by how well they worked. Whether you were an engineer or a factory worker, whether you worked hard or not. But in the consumer era, people are judged by their choices. What brand of clothes you wear, what phone model you use, what tutoring class you enroll your kid in, or even which cafe you check in at on weekends. These choices have become the new measure of your ability and your taste. It's like how people around us post gym selfies or travel photos abroad. They're not just sharing their lives, they're proving something. I know how to consume. I'm keeping up with the mainstream. Someone buys a niche designer bag and makes sure to say, "This brand has such a great concept." But what they're really saying is, "I have taste. I'm not just chasing big names." On the other hand, if you're always buying budget stuff, can't afford popular online courses, and spend holidays at home, even with a stable job, you might quietly feel poor. Not poor in the sense of starving, but poor because you can't keep up with the rhythm of consumption. Poor in a way that makes you feel not normal. That's what Bauman calls the aesthetics of consumption. Today, when people judge whether someone is normal, they look at how they use consumption to express their value, not how they work. And then, the meaning of work changed too. It's no longer a duty you must do, but something you choose to do, depending on whether it's fun or not. In the consumer era, work splits into two worlds. One type is work with aesthetic value, like designers, programmers, influencers, or creative positions in companies. These jobs are interesting, challenging, and let people express their personal value. Designers can turn their ideas into creations. Bloggers grow by sharing their views and building audiences. They feel fulfilled, even see it as a mission. No one has to push them to work late. They do it willingly because doing it feels good. The other kind of job has no aesthetic value, like factory workers, delivery riders, supermarket cashiers, or basic admin roles in companies. These jobs are boring, repetitive, and offer no challenge. A factory worker tightens the same screws every day. A delivery rider runs the same routes. It's dull. They do it just to make a living. No one treats this kind of job as a calling. The only goal is to save enough to move on to something better. What's even harsher is that mission-driven jobs are a privilege. Only a few people get them. Most people are stuck with low-value, tiring jobs. And those are the most unstable ones. Companies want flexible labor. They hire you today and might fire you tomorrow. Machines can replace you, like self-checkout replacing cashiers, or they can find cheaper workers through outsourcing. Bauman says that at this point, work can no longer give people a stable identity or dignity like it did in the industrial age. Your job could disappear any time, and even if it doesn't make you feel valuable anymore. And that leads to the biggest change in the consumer era. The poor are no longer those without jobs, but those without the ability to consume. Bauman calls them flawed consumers. Let's break down what flawed really means. First, they lack the money to consume, not in the sense of starving, but they can't join in mainstream consumption. Others can buy $150 sneakers, eat at 70-a-head restaurants, and enroll their kids in $3,000 extracurriculars. You can only afford the $15 version, a cheap meal, and maybe a free public class. That sense of falling behind makes you feel excluded from normal life, like everyone's playing a game, but you can't even afford the entry ticket, so you just stand outside watching. Second, they lack the right to consume. These days, consumption isn't just about having money. You also need permission. If you don't have a credit card, you can't buy a house or a car in installments. If your credit score is bad, you can't even unlock a shared bike. No stable income? Then you can't use buy now, pay later options online. These barriers block a lot of people from the consumption system entirely. Even if they want to consume, they simply can't. The third, and probably the most painful thing about being poor, is losing the joy that comes from consumption. In other words, boredom. The consumer age simply cannot tolerate boredom. Shopping malls hold sales, theme parks launch new attractions, short video apps keep rolling out fresh content, all to make sure you have something to do and something to enjoy. Even going to the supermarket on weekends is a kind of consumption-style leisure. Just pushing the cart around and picking items already feels enjoyable. But poor people can't take part in these things. They don't have money for amusement parks or snacks, so they just stay home, stare at the wall, or watch TV. And that kind of boredom hurts more than being broke, because it constantly reminds you that you're not like others, that somehow you're not normal. Bauman gives a real example in his book. A young, unemployed man said, "I just sit at home reading newspapers every day. I've got no money and nowhere to go. It's really boring." Sometimes he would rather wander the streets, even if he didn't buy anything, because it still felt better than sitting at home. You see, what he feared wasn't hunger. It was that kind of boredom that comes from having no choice, nothing to do, and feeling abandoned by society. At this point, you might ask, didn't governments used to have welfare systems to help the poor, like job placements and unemployment benefits? Why don't they care anymore? That's another big shift in the consumer age. The decline of the welfare state. During the industrial era, welfare existed because the system needed a reserve of labor. When the economy picked up, you needed workers ready to go, so the government had to keep the poor alive and in shape. But now things are different. With globalization, capital can move anywhere. Companies don't need to support local workers. They can just go build factories in Vietnam or India. The local poor are no longer useful, so the government sees no reason to keep spending money on them. Even worse, in many developed countries, welfare has gradually shifted from something everyone benefits from to something only the poor get. Back then, programs like universal health care or public education were used by everyone, so people were happy to pay taxes. But now, welfare is seen as something only for the poor. The middle class doesn't use it, so they start to think, why should my hard-earned money go to support those lazy people who don't work? As a result, welfare services keep getting worse. No one cares about the poor who rely on them. They're even insulted as parasites. It's a vicious cycle. Welfare being exclusive to the poor makes it worse, which makes taxpayers resent it more, which makes it even harder for the poor to get help. In the end, everyone starts thinking welfare is useless and might as well be scrapped. So by now, the rules of the consumer age are clear. Society wants consumers, not workers. Poverty is no longer defined by unemployment, but by the inability to consume, by not knowing how or not having the means to buy. But here's the problem. During the industrial age, you could still send the excess population to the colonies. Today, the world is full. There's nowhere left to ship off these flawed consumers. They stay where they are, turning into problems that society can't throw away. So what now? Should society keep helping them, or start finding ways to control them? That's what we'll explore next. The real dilemma of the new poor under globalization. Where do all these leftover people go? In the last part, we talked about how the consumer age turned people who can't consume into the new poor, but the welfare state has collapsed. No one's willing to spend money helping these flawed consumers. What makes things worse is that today is nothing like the industrial era. Back then, surplus people could be shipped off to colonies. Europeans sent their poor to the Americas or Australia to clear land, out of sight, out of mind. But now, the planet is full. There's practically nowhere left to dump the excess. These people have to stay where they are. And that's become one of globalization's biggest headaches. The local poor have turned into burdens that can't be thrown away or ignored. So how should society deal with them? Let's look back at how the industrial era dealt with this problem so easily. Back then, European colonialism was essentially about shifting the burden. For example, Britain sent displaced farmers and unemployed workers to Canada or Australia, telling them they could farm, mine, and survive there. On the surface, it looked like giving the poor a fresh start. But in reality, it was just exporting domestic social problems abroad. Those colonies were already home to indigenous people, who were driven out or killed by force, and their land was taken to give Europeans a place to live. Bauman mocks this perfectly. He says it's like when your house is full of garbage, and instead of sorting it, you carry the trash bag over to your neighbor's yard and dump it there. The only reason it worked then was that the neighbors, the indigenous people, couldn't fight back. But now, globalization lets capital move freely, but people can't. Companies looking for cheap labor don't need to keep the poor around. They just move factories to Vietnam or India. They can import raw materials from Africa or South America for less. Local poor people can't compete with overseas workers, and they don't qualify to migrate to rich countries either. So they stay where they are. We see this around us. Old factories close, middle-aged workers can't learn new skills, can't find jobs, and survive on temporary gigs or welfare. They're the surplus people of globalization, with nowhere to go. And since they can't be dumped, society's strategy changes, from helping the poor to managing the poor. In the past, the focus was on helping them find jobs and boosting their purchasing power. Now, it's about keeping them under control, so they don't disturb the normal order of life. Bauman says there are two main strategies, both brutally realistic. The first is turning social problems into legal problems. In the past, people said the poor were poor because society failed to give them opportunities. Now, they say it's the poor's own fault. They're lazy or irresponsible. For example, if a poor man steals a loaf of bread because he's hungry, people used to ask why. What drove him to that point? Today, he's just labeled a criminal and sent to jail. If someone is homeless and begging on the street, people used to give a little money. Now they say it ruins the city's image, and even pass laws to ban begging. This shift is striking. In the US, for instance, welfare budgets keep getting slashed, while more and more prisons are being built. Statistics show that in the US, about 1 in every 100 people is in prison, and most of them are poor. Many are locked up for minor crimes like petty theft, but they stay in there for years. Bauman argues that this is society replacing help with punishment, locking the poor away so people don't have to see them or deal with their problems. It's convenient. No disorder on the streets, no tough questions about inequality. But really, it solves nothing. When those people get out, they still don't have jobs, still can't consume, and end up trapped in the same cycle of poverty. The second strategy is to build more walls, to make the poor invisible. These walls aren't just physical, but psychological too. Physically, the poor are pushed into ghettos or faraway suburbs. In many big cities, the downtown areas are full of skyscrapers, malls, and offices, while the poor live in cheap housing on the outskirts, spending hours commuting every day. Psychologically, the media paints the poor as dangerous or immoral. News stories often show them in shabby clothes and run-down homes, with headlines about crime or desperation. Slowly, this teaches the public that poor people are scary, lazy, or somehow responsible for their own misery. Middle-class people then start avoiding poor neighborhoods and even supporting harsher control policies. This psychological separation is crueler than physical segregation. It convinces people that the poor's problems have nothing to do with them. And that's the real crisis of the new poor in globalization. They have nowhere to go, and no place in society. Businesses don't need them, governments ignore them, and ordinary people fear them. They've become society's outsiders, excluded from every version of normal life. But the question is, can this really go on? Bauman asks a sharp question. Can a society permanently treat part of its people as disposable trash? Of course not. These surplus people aren't truly useless. They just live under rules that give them no space. Some can fix appliances, some can craft things by hand, some want to care for the elderly or serve their communities. But the market doesn't value those skills. Those tasks aren't recognized as real work. Bauman's point isn't to make us despair, it's to make us think. Is there another way for these people to live with dignity? At the end of the book, Bauman suggests two possible directions. They sound idealistic, but they're worth deep thought. And that's exactly what we'll dive into next. Facing the crisis of the new poor, do we have better options? For example, can we separate income from employment? Make sure everyone receives a basic living allowance, whether they have a job or not. And can we redefine what counts as work, so unpaid but valuable activities, like caregiving and community service, are also recognized? Only when we understand these ideas can we begin to see a real way out of the crisis. At this point, we've basically connected all of Bauman's core ideas. From the industrial age, where not working meant being poor, to the consumer age, where not knowing how to consume made you poor, and now to globalization, where the surplus people have nowhere to go. It might sound like he's talking about the poor, but in reality, he's describing all of us. Don't think the new poor are far away from you. Today's job market is full of freelancers, gig workers, and temporary hires. Many people look like they have stable jobs, holding on to what seems like a secure offer, but one day the company restructures or the industry cools down, and that job just disappears overnight. Today, you can still use your paycheck to buy milk tea or an online course, which makes you a qualified consumer. But tomorrow, if you lose that income, you still have credit card bills to pay, rent due, and you can't even afford to join the normal social activities anymore. Suddenly, you become a defective consumer. That's not an exaggeration. That's just the reality of the consumer era. Like Bauman said, the image of the poor hides our own fears and anxieties. When we worry about poverty, we're really worrying about our own future self. Whether we might one day be labeled as redundant just because we didn't consume the right way or couldn't keep up with the pace of change. Bauman didn't write this book to make us panic. He wrote it to wake us up, to remind us not to be trapped by the idea that working hard guarantees security or that spending more means success. A truly normal life isn't about earning more or buying more. It's about living with dignity, whether or not you have a job, and whether or not you can afford to consume like everyone else. Today, a lot of people are working overtime, rushing to meet deadlines, while secretly worrying they'll be replaced. They're scrolling through live streams and placing orders, while stressing about whether they can pay next month's bills. That's exactly what it looks like to be trapped by the rules of the consumer era. But we can think differently. What if work wasn't just about making money, but also about doing something you actually enjoy? And what if consumption wasn't about proving that you're normal, but simply about buying what you truly need? Maybe then, we could escape the anxiety of becoming one of the new poor. Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with Bauman's ultimate question. What kind of society do we really want? Do we keep treating those who can't consume as a burden? Or do we build a new system together? One where everyone, even if they're not great at earning or spending, can still have food, dignity, and a sense of belonging? The answer, honestly, is in our own hands. Because a society where no one is considered extra is the only kind of society truly worth striving for. And finally, congratulations, you've just finished another book.